Okay, good afternoon, everybody. It's my pleasure to introduce Ashish Sabharwal, who works at the Allen Institute for Artificial Intelligence. Before that at Cornell and IBM, and before that at the University of Washington. So, welcome back.
Thanks, Dan. And thanks for inviting me to be here for the talk. It's a pleasure to see many people, see some familiar faces, actually spread out many places. That's good. So as Dan said, I was a grad student here way back when we were in the old building, before the new building, and before you move on to the, I guess, next new building. I used to work a lot in theory, slowly moved towards AI, spent some years at Cornell doing more AI, then some time as IBM Watson, and now at the Allen Institute for AI, or AI2, I work on probabilistic inference, graphical models, combinatorial reasoning, and optimization. And today I'll talk about some work we have done on answering natural language questions in the domain of science using some optimization techniques. Okay. Let me start by thanking some collaborators who have been involved in this work. Of course, we have a whole project called Aristo that I'll talk about in a moment. Particularly Peter, Oren, and Tushar have been involved in this integer programming part that I'll focus on today. Daniel Khashabi was an intern from UIUC last summer. He's the one who spun off this ILP project and seeded it to start with. And Eric Gripkov, who was an intern with us from UW a couple years ago, and he started off the reasoning using probabilistic inference and Markov Logic Networks. So we'll touch upon all these topics in the talk. So I want to start with three takeaways for the talk. First, that AI2 is an exciting place for doing cutting-edge research and engineering. As you can, there are some people here who have been at AI2. Some people like Dan Weld who are on our advisory board, and I think I just saw Hannah walk in the back, who's very involved with certain projects here. So it's hopefully they can attest to the liveliness of the place. The second point is that standardized exams or tests, such as in science and math, are an exciting challenge for both finding new ways to push AI forward and to assess the progress in a measurable way. We have done a bunch of work in the last couple of years, and I would say we are just starting to scratch the surface of the real problems and getting a sense of the solutions. And finally, the third part is where I spend most of the time on, is that semi-structured reasoning for answering these questions can go a long way in making progress in this direction, and it can help you come up with effective and robust solutions that go beyond factoid-style question answering or information retrieval methods. Okay? So those are my three take-home messages. Let me start with that in mind with the roadmap of the talk. I'll describe very briefly the Aristo project at AI2, and I'll motivate standardized test as a challenge for AI or as a test bed. Then I'll focus most of the technical talk on semi-structured reasoning for science question answering. I'll start with a motivating example, hopefully illustrating why we need such kind of reasoning and what that could give us. I'll talk about knowledge in the form of tables, which is our internal representation of knowledge. And then we'll say how you can combine it with integer programming to come up with a solver that's fairly robust in answering certain questions. In the experimental results, I'll highlight three things. First is that you can get good performance compared to IR methods working on very large data set. Second, you can be much more robust to perturbations of questions. And third is that this ILP approach is much more useful and successful in utilizing semi-structured knowledge compared to some of the other things that I'll talk about. Okay. And then I'll summarize. So let me start with the Aristo project in AI2, and again, many of you know this. For those who don't, we are in this building, very close to Gasworks Park, very close from here. This was an institute founded by Paul Allen a couple of years ago. It's a non-profit organization dedicated to building AI systems that can do reading, reasoning, and learning, and progressively get better over time. We started, when I joined about 2 years ago, we are about a dozen people. Now we have been growing fast, about 50 people now. We are still actively hiring, both at the research and engineering levels. So if anybody is graduating, you're welcome to drop us a note and see if there's a fit. We do have a year-round internship program, and many people here have gone through that program, so hopefully they can tell you more about it. It's the summer program has been very successful. It's full for this year, but we have interns coming in fall, spring, anytime. So if you find a problem that interests you and you want to dig deeper into it with real data sets and engineers and researchers helping out, please drop us a note. There are 4 major projects: Aristo, Semantic Scholar, the Vision, and Euclid. Aristo is the one that I'll talk about. It's about reading and reasoning about science. Starting with elementary level science, but going up to 8th grade and college level science. Semantic Scholar is our version of Google Scholar that focuses on doing intelligent search over large scientific literatures. The Vision project is doing something similar, but in the visual space of images and videos. And then the Euclid project is similar to Aristo, but focuses on math and geometry questions. Now, these all might sound very different as projects, but they all touch upon fundamental pieces of AI, namely language, vision, knowledge representation, and reasoning. And there's lots of tight connections, both at the inspiration level and also the techniques that we share amongst the projects. And I should mention we have strong ties with the UW, as I said earlier. Dan and Ed Lazowska are on our boards. Ali actually leads the Vision team, and Hannah is very closely involved with the Euclid project, and interns, of course, again. So about Aristo, it's a project whose vision is to eventually make knowledgeable machines. We envision a point where we can have a system that has access to lots of large amounts of general and scientific knowledge that is stored in a form that you can compute with. Now, we're not committing to, say, a logical form or anything specific. It could be statistical correlation. It could be logic, relations, probability, whatever you have. But it's converted from plain text into a form that you can reason with. And then the part is to work with that knowledge to do reasoning and explain your answers. So this is saying by way that we just don't want to create a big knowledge base and look up answers into it. We want to reason with the thing. And so how to represent the knowledge and what's the best way to reason with it are the 2 challenges that we often address. Our focus from the start is to look at standardized science tests. Typically, we are looking at 4th and 8th grade at the moment. And so the goal is to acquire knowledge that's both, again, common sense knowledge and science knowledge that's sufficient to answer such questions. And concretely, we want to just basically take a test as it is, just as we give to humans, and pass this exam. Right? So as we look at these questions, and I'll give you some examples, many science questions turn out to require very broad knowledge and very different kinds of reasoning. And it almost seems like to be able to solve this problem, we are probably solving a big chunk of AI. It's not like a small thing that you can make progress and call it done. To solve it really, if we have done that, we would have made a substantial progress in AI, state of the art. Okay. So you might wonder, why is this even hard? Haven't we made big advances in AI in the last decade or 2 decades? And of course we have, right? So we have self-driving cars. We have robots that can actually climb stairs now. It was a big challenge for decades. We have voice recognition systems that can fairly well understand what you're asking to do, at least in a narrow domain, and then ask you questions if they don't understand. This doesn't show very well. It's the cat recognition thing from Google, big progress in vision, and we can challenge expert humans in games that we thought were very, very hard to solve, right? And we can do very well in that. So that's all well and great, and we have really made progress in all these things. But what I would claim is that AI systems of today are still very far from demonstrating human-like intelligence in relatively simple tasks, namely things like elementary level science exams that we use routinely to assess human intelligence of real human beings. Right? So if the systems are really that powerful, well, maybe they should be able to take the simple tests at 2nd grade, 4th grade, 6th grade, 8th grade. How can we do? I'll show you some numbers. We don't do very well, and this is a challenge that inspires some of our work. So, in fact, let me show you an example here. So to assess how far we are and get more of the community engaged, at AI2 we started a competition last fall. It's one of these. It was set up as a Kaggle challenge, if you know about Kaggle. And the question was, can you build a system that can take 8th grade exam, fairly simple questions, no diagrams, no geometry things, just plain English, multiple choice, 4 answers, you got to pick the right answer. Right? So this, in fact, it got a lot of attention, maybe not as much from the academic communities that we would like, but there were still about 800 teams that participated, and this is how their progress grew over time. And of course, everybody started at close to 25%, which is the baseline guessing, and then slowly improved over a few months to get to this point, and they got very close to 60%. Passing rate is 65 on the whole exam that has all kinds of complicated questions, including diagrams and fill in the blanks. This is the simplest part of the thing. So what I'm trying to demonstrate here is that it's not, at least it's not an easy problem. You can have 800 teams, which is probably, 1,000 some people working on it, trying to solve it, and you don't get very far, right? And so with that in mind, we have at least for the foreseeable future, we have set a crisp, measurable goal. Can we build a system that passes such tests? Okay, and it's measurable because you can literally give the test as it is, no pre-processing. Can you answer? Right? So there are many challenges that as you might imagine. You need all kinds of knowledge. I'll give some examples. You need to understand what the question is asking, and you need to do reasoning that's efficient and robust to noise. Right? So here are two examples to make it more concrete. The first one says, which physical structure would best help a bear to survive a winter in New York State? And these are many exams are coming from New York State, so you'll see New York often mentioned. The answer here is thick fur. And how would you go about answering this? Well, you might have read it exactly somewhere. Chances are maybe you haven't, but maybe you have some notion of, you're talking about surviving in winter, you're talking about a bear, which is an animal, and maybe you know that animals have fur that help them stay warm. Now you need to connect that by realizing that a physical structure might refer to a body part like thick fur, and specifically New York State is a distractor. It's not really relevant to what you're trying to do, but what you want to know is a bear is an animal, surviving required or is helped by thick fur, and you answer that question. So this it gives you some challenge, idea of the challenge of the natural language processing and focusing on the salient terms, but this is still an easy question. Here's another question which is fairly long. I won't read it, but what it's really asking is that if I do an experiment by placing a plant either in a dark room or close to a window, what am I testing? Right? And it has all these distractors that talk about I'm giving them the same type and amount of soil and give the same amount of water. What has changed? So all kinds of distractors in the question, but if you understand what the question is really asking, you should be able to say, well, it's really testing the responsiveness of the plant to light. So again, you can probably start to imagine that information retrieval-like systems are going to have trouble just looking this up in a large corpus. You really have to understand what the question is asking, what are salient terms, and what are distractors that you can ignore. Okay. So we do think that not a single approach can be very effective in doing all of these things. So what the approach we have taken is to build an ensemble of solvers. So we do think IR and PMI things, statistical correlation, have a role to play, and we have solvers that use that, using starting from large corpus. But what I'll talk about today is this integer programming-based solver that represents a more semi-structured or structured reasoning attempt at this question. And then we'll see that the solver itself may not beat the IR solvers as it is per se, but it will be complementary, and in combination they'll improve the performance statistically significantly. Okay. So that's the first part. Let me delve into a motivating example that illustrates what I mean by semi-structured reasoning and why we might want such things. So semi-structured reasoning is nicely illustrated by this example, which says in New York State, the longest period of daylight occurs during which month? And I'll give you a few seconds to think, because I want you to think how you're trying to answer this question. Right? Okay. Now for a computer, you can imagine at least two ways of doing that. You could either build a sophisticated physics model that talks about planetary motion, and sorry, these things are not showing very well, but this is sun, and these are planets, the Earth going around it, and what's salient here is that Earth has an axis which is tilted, and that causes seasons, and that causes all kinds of things, right? So yeah, if you could build that, it's a very powerful model. You could do all kinds of reasoning, but this is not really a scalable way, right? How many models are you going to build if you have 20 topics or 200 topics? It's very hard to do. It's very hard to automate. So we would like to not take that route. It's a very slow process. You could go with information retrieval or statistical correlation methods, and then you could say, well, yeah, it's something easy I can build. How about I get a large corpus of data, maybe gigabytes or hundreds of gigabytes of data, and see if there's some correlation between things like New York, longest daylight, and month. And you might be lucky, you might find the answer. It's easy, relatively easy to implement if you know how to work with large data sets. And you can there's a lot of work in statistical correlation, and specifically one I'll mention is pointwise mutual information that can go a long way in answering questions like this, even if you haven't seen exactly this one sentence written somewhere. Nevertheless, many of these approaches do require big pieces of the puzzle being written as is in some large corpus, and that is not always the case. Right? So our premise here is that if you want to answer the question in a way that makes you comfortable that you have understood the phenomena behind it, you should also be able to answer variations of it. By that I mean, if I take New York State and I replace it with New Zealand, you should realize that something has changed and the answer will flip from June to December. Similarly, if I go and change one more salient word like longest to shortest, again the answer would change. And the same thing about daylight versus night. So the thesis here is that if you understand how you are answering the question and what the phenomena behind is, you will be able to answer all of these things. And I'll show later that certain methods fail and certain methods do not fail in this kind of perturbation. Okay. So one example of semi-structured reasoning that if we can implement can get us around this bottleneck is to do the following, is to think of the piece of and think of this whole puzzle in small pieces, which relies on small chunks of knowledge that are manageable, swappable pieces represented in some semi-structured way. And I'll say later what semi-structured is. But think of, in this case, things like you might realize that the question really needs knowledge about regions like New York, the hemispheres in which they belong, and maybe notions like summer solstice or equinox. Right? So your goal would be to take pieces of knowledge like this and put it together in the right way so you can answer the question and overcome the brittleness that we saw that might happen in the previous slide. So one way of doing that would be to realize that two key terms are New York and longest day. What matters about them is that New York is in northern hemisphere, longest day refers to the summer solstice orbital event, and then if you ask about the month, you can look that up and say, well, yeah, June is probably the right answer because that's when summer solstice happen in northern hemisphere. Yeah.
So it seems it's already pretty hard if you want to realize for New York the important thing is the northern hemisphere, and for longest day, like you need to relate it to summer. So I think the first one is already very hard.
It is a hard problem, and that's what we want to make progress on. And the slide would end by saying, how do we actually do this? Well, we get to that. It's not obvious. You're right. And I think the way a system might work is pull up everything that you think might be related to New York and bring it forward. Similarly, other things about longest day where you have seen them. And the system will pull many different kinds of relations about them. And then the inference task is to pick the right ones that do actually fit together. Because some of the other information about New York may not fit with the rest of the question. Right? So New York has, I know, polar bears, or it doesn't actually, but whatever else it has, that may not help you answer the question. So the task still remains. Okay. But if you could do that, and bear with me for some time, we'll show you that you can do this, at least to some extent. If you could do this, then it's not hard to see that if you change New York to New Zealand, you'll realize that the relevant part changes to southern hemisphere and the answer changes, and similarly longest to shortest day, and so on. Right? So if you could get to this part, hopefully I can somewhat convince you that if you could do this, you have a principled approach to answering questions that on the side gives you explanations of this form, and it's robust to variations. Right? The rest of the talk is about how do you get there. Right? At least one approach. So to get to that point, we need to solve two pieces of a puzzle. One is how do you represent knowledge and how do you reason about them. Specifically, given New York, what kind of data structure will let you pull up things like the hemisphere it belongs to, or that it's a state or versus a country and things like that, and similarly other parts of the knowledge. One point I'll emphasize is that we would want knowledge that is structured, yet it has some flexibility. We'll see why. And then the second piece of the puzzle, once we have a knowledge represented, is to do reasoning over it, and we want it to be effective, controllable, and scalable. There are approaches where you can do very well on the knowledge representation side, but you don't get this, so you want to balance the two out. Okay? So let's start with relations. Knowledge, which we'll represent as relations. So if you think of the knowledge spectrum, on one hand, and I know many of you are NLP people, you can think of knowledge as just being a lot of unstructured text. Unstructured text that you can derive from books, from the web, from study guides, all kinds of sources. This is obviously a way of representing knowledge that's very easy to acquire. You can get gigabytes and terabytes of data, but it's not so easy to reason with, right? Because the nature of it not being structured, it's not clear what constitutes a good alignment or good chaining of different pieces of information. On the other hand, you can go completely structured and define very, beautiful and neat ontologies, and they will probably fall apart in terms of completeness and the coverage of knowledge that you have. You can also represent knowledge in terms of probabilistic first-order rules, and in fact, that's what we did in the beginning. You can start to define the events in the world in terms of logic, with some weights associated with them. For example, for the bear question, we might say the knowledge is that if X is an animal and X has fur, then X stays warm. And this can become a logical form with the conjunction and an implication with maybe some existential quantifier. Right? So you can start representing knowledge that way. It turns out all these things are potentially easy to work with if you can get them right, but just getting this kind of knowledge is much, much harder. So we are going to take a place in between the two extremes. We'll have relational tables to represent our knowledge. They won't have directions like the probabilistic logic rules, but they will have some structure because they'll be in form of relations. They will also be flexible because they'll have free-form text as part of the relations. So here are two examples related to the question we saw earlier. The country location example that might say that France is in the northern hemisphere, whereas Brazil is in the southern hemisphere. And then a table about orbital events that represents some science knowledge, which is the month in which certain events, orbital events happen in various hemispheres. You will probably also notice that we haven't committed to a particular ontology. This table represents north hemisphere location, the same knowledge that this represents as north hemisphere with title location is represented here as northern with title hemisphere. And we want to bridge the gap at runtime rather than committing to an ontology and limiting our options from the get-go. Okay. Now you can imagine building a lot of such tables. I showed some examples in the next slide about all kinds of concepts that you think might be relevant to the domain of interest. In our case, it's things like energy, forces, tools, functions of body organs, and so on. I would highlight here that this is a fairly simple structure. It's just n-ary tables. Typically, there are 2, 3, or 4 columns, not very big, but they are not often just SVO triples. They're a little more structured than that. Okay? But they are flexible content because inside the tables we have put basically text that we derived from plain text. We are not trying to make any psych-like claims. This is not going to be a complete, exhaustive list of everything you need to know. It's not going to be super consistent or adequate to answer your questions. It's just going to be a simple cache of knowledge in a way that we can work with fairly easily, and hopefully we can generate this knowledge easily from text as well. In terms of what the tables contain, this is the kind of knowledge you need to answer 4th grade science questions. This comes from the syllabus. You need to know things about celestial phenomena, the Earth, things about phase change, solids, liquid, gases, energy, environment, human impact, and a wide variety of things. Right? So hopefully this also gives you a sense of the broad sense of knowledge you need to know, and also certain common sense things that you might need in terms of environment and human impact of various actions.
I hate to heckle you, especially in the beginning of the talk, but as I look at that knowledge there, it seems to me like it's very specifically designed for that one question, and I find myself wondering if it will ever be used for any other question. And if that's the case, and maybe you would disagree, I think that actually there's a variety of questions that knowledge is going to be useful for, but if it's only useful for one question, then really are we making progress?
That's an excellent question. That's something we struggle with, like sort of on a daily basis in the design of tables and how to populate them. So these particular tables, like this country location table, you can imagine being used in other ways as well. Orbital event, definitely, it's a very narrow focused table. But most of and I chose those mostly as an illustrative example, but things like properties of objects, colors, what color is apple, what conductivity of a material is there, those kinds of things are very general. You can chain them together to answer different kinds of questions. Besides these sort of manually authored schema tables, we also have automatically generated like subject verb object tables that I don't like, but they do get used very often as well. They boost the performance of the solver by 10% range. So to answer your questions, yeah, it's correct that certain tables have very specific usages, but if you make the tables granular, they represent pieces that you can link together for different kinds of questions as well. And this is not a particularly great example. So one more slide on how we get the tables, and I should put a disclaimer that I'm not a knowledge extraction person. I'm a user of tables. I try to tell people what I need, what I can use, and then they come up with ways to either automatically or semi-automatically populate such tables. So for example, for the case of the subject matter, you might go look through a lot of text that you have in your study guides, get some similar sentences from the web, and figure out that commonly occurring concepts are things like entities and their colors, or phase transitions that say that you can change solid to a liquid by applying heat, or tools and the measurements that they do, and so on. At the moment, the ontologies, the schemas are designed manually by us. And that's sort of an open topic. Can you actually figure out what are the recurring themes and define the schema also automatically? But given the schema, we have ways to either automatically or at least semi-automatically populate rows, starting with some seed knowledge. So think of it as distant supervision. We give it 20 rows and then go find more things and turn into a table of 200 rows. Right? So putting this all together, we have this table store in Aristo's database that has about 85 tables, that has 10,000 rows and 30,000 cells. And this is definitely way more general than like some hand-picked rows and cells of things. And it's necessary to be able to answer unseen questions. Okay. So that's all I'll say about knowledge represented at tables, and I'll focus most of the time on how we use this knowledge. So the way we are going to use this knowledge is to treat it as a graph optimization problem and throw in integer programming optimization framework to do the optimization. Okay. So here's how the framework works. We start with a question, and remember these are multiple choice questions. So that's all we'll focus on for now. You have a question Q and answer options A. You have access to these knowledge tables, those 85 tables from the previous slide. And then what we do is put them together into a module that's an ILP model builder. And this, I'll describe more what that does. It takes, of course, it takes these things as input. It doesn't know anything about language, so it takes another black box as input, which is the lexical similarity or entailment black box. Right? And now this black box is not a big thing. It's not doing like sentence-to-sentence RTE or some very complex task. Otherwise, it would really solve the problem. It's a very simple thing. Like it answers things like, is dog an animal? Is gravity a kind of force? And so some very simple word level entailments. And it also does it as a short phrase level. So for example, it might say that long ears entails big ears. Right? So that it's very simple lexical unit. It needs to be able to bridge the gap. And then given all these three inputs, now the ILP model builder comes up with a model, which is a function of the tables, the question, and the answer option. At this point, we feed it to an off-the-shelf ILP optimization engine, and that comes up that selects an answer A sub I from A, along with what I'll describe as a support graph in the next few slides, and a score for that answer option. Right? So that's the whole pipeline of how this thing goes. And this model is an integer linear programming model. It could have been your favorite language for optimization. We just use this because I'm kind of conversant and familiar with it. It's saying you're going to come up with variables and constraints on those variables, and as well as an optimization objective function such that if you maximize that function, you hopefully arrive at the right answer. So the main idea behind this model or this whole approach is the following: is the notion of the support graph. And we want to treat this knowledge as a big knowledge graph, not the same as Google Knowledge Graph, but it's a graph on knowledge that is going to connect your question to an answer through tables. Let me illustrate that with an example, the same example that we started with New York State and longest period of daylight. First question you ask is, how is the relevant piece of knowledge expressed in my knowledge base? And you might do some simple TF-IDF like search, word overlap to figure out that, okay, maybe I need some knowledge about cities, states, countries. Maybe I need some knowledge about period of daylight, and I know that relates to orbital events because it's mentioned many times in that table. You could also realize that there is a little disconnect. This table talks about geographical properties, and city-states are really more political boundaries. So you need something that connects these two, and that's again a simple pre-processing you could do to figure out what are the tables that link existing tables. And this a table might be something that links political regions with geographical things like hemispheres. Then you start looking at the tables a little more carefully, and maybe here I'm giving you a very simplified snapshot. These are tables each with like hundreds of rows. Well, except this one. This doesn't have many rows. In fact, neither does this, but these two tables have a lot of rows. But you look at the relevant part of the tables and you say, how can I now start connecting these so that I can go from question to an answer by using this knowledge? In other words, I want to link this information in order to identify and select an answer that's best supported by knowledge. So it's like doing abductive reasoning. The correct answer is the one that has the biggest support or the strongest support. So you might start doing that by just looking at the words or phrases, by just doing like simple chunking of the question and say that, okay, maybe I see some overlap between the tables and the knowledge. So New York appears here, longest, long, similar period of daylight, day duration, they're sort of similar. And this notion of similarity is that lexical black box that I mentioned earlier. By the way, that black box uses WordNet ontology and word2vec for similarity. You can find these things and maybe you can guess that the answer might lie in this month. Again, this is a simple example in terms of the contents of the cell, but it illustrates the chaining and reasoning that we want to do. Now, this really doesn't take you from question to the answer. So now you start building this graph and say, well, can I connect things together so that I have a connected graph that helps me go from, say, New York State to the country US? And you can say, well, okay, US is also represented as United States, maybe something to do with Northern Hemisphere. I could have gone to this row here or to the row below it, but I have a little more support for summer solstice because this table was talking about long, and that, you can get the idea. It's some complex things going on, and the whole part of the integer programming thing is to search over all possibilities and figure out the one that works the best. Okay? So that's what we want to achieve. That's the goal of the ILP thing, and the exercise for research purposes is to design an ILP that would achieve this for you, that will come up with a support graph that's meaningful and that's desirable. Okay? And so here are my two brief slides on how we do this. Again, a little more formally, we want to define constraints C and an objective function F such that if you maximize your objective function subject to the constraints, you end up arriving at the correct answer. Still a very ill-defined problem from operations research perspective, but I guess that's what we have. It's not very straightforward, as you might imagine from the previous example. There are many possible proof structures. I showed you one graph, but the answer might lie in just one row in one table, or it might appeal to multiple tables, or you might have to do like parallel evidence across multiple rows within a table. So you have to kind of think about all these possibilities to account for them. Then you have to give some rewards for doing good things, but you also have to penalize for making spurious connections. And here you might use information from this lexical similarity black box, reward strong links, penalize weak links. But of course, the similarity black box itself is often imperfect. If you have worked with WordNet, you know there are missing links, there are incorrect links, there are things that are just totally domain irrelevant, like fox is related to human, or entire is related to animal, that have really no bearing to what you need for fourth grade science. So you have to account for and compensate for those noise pieces. There's of course always partial or missing knowledge, so you can't put too strong constraints, and then you have to take into account question logic. There might be negations in the question, or it might talk about comparison of object, like which is a better conductor of electricity versus an absolute value. So you have to do all these things. It's a laborious task, but can be done. We do it by creating an ILP model whose units of operation are the basic lexical units that we have in the question and the tables. So these lexical units are chunks of the question. So we do like a typical NLP chunker, take each chunk as one unit. Each cell of the table is a unit, and each answer option is a unit. Okay? And we have about 50 high-level constraints and preferences that try to capture the kind of desirable reasoning we want to do. Variables, again, they define the space of all possible support graphs, like the one you saw in the example. And it's trying to capture which nodes should be part of the graph and which edges should be part of the graph. The objective function tries to operationalize the intuition that better support graphs have a higher objective function. And to do that, we have to always reward active units. If you have if more information is being used, it's probably a good thing, but you don't want to get spurious links, so you penalize some of those. You probably want to cover more of the question terms. Maybe you want to cover some salient terms in the question, so you try to put all of these things in your objective function. So for example, if the question says which form of energy, you better pay attention to energy. Or if it mentions a specific science term like condensation, evaporation, photosynthesis, you should be using those terms in your answer. So you just give boost to those. In terms of constraints, we have all kinds of constraints on the graph that try to make it both meaningful and scalable. So on the structural side, we have things like the graph better be connected. You should cover a lot, at least some minimum part of the question. You use appropriate tables. We have a little more domain-specific things, like if you're using parallel evidence, which is multiple rows of the same kind of relation, they should have like a similar signature or similar activity signature. I'm giving these examples without really any detail, just to highlight that you have to think about all these issues, but you can do that and come up with a variety of these relations. Maybe the two interesting ones are these semantic constraints that say if you start joining tables, it doesn't make sense to just arbitrarily join things if they have a good word overlap. You want to have some semantic meaning in there. So we define relations as having certain semantic meaning, and then you join tables if joining them makes sense in a certain way, right? And similarly, there are subtle things like a phase change question where you might have change from water to liquid or change from liquid to water. As bag of words, of course, they are the same, but you want to take that structure into account and appropriately reason with it. Okay. So that's it. I'll show you some experimental results on how this thing does, and I'm happy to take questions going into more detail into the ILP model if people are interested. For the experiments, I'll show work on 4th grade science questions. This is from New York Regents exam. These are publicly available. We use 6 years of exams as hidden test set and 6 for training. The way these are scored is you get 1 point for a question. If you have a k-way tie, you get 1 over k if the correct answer was part of your tie. We also have a perturbed version of these questions that'll highlight an interesting aspect of brittleness of IR-like methods. And then if you noticed here, we have only about 130 questions. It's pretty small for typical NLP task, but that's what we have. Most states just don't release their questions. We have recently hired some companies to create more questions and released a little data set of 2,500 questions on the website just like last week or 2 weeks ago. These do span both 4th and 8th grade, but if you want to play with it, definitely this is the data set I'll start looking at just to get a flavor of the problem. Okay, so what do we do with these questions? We're going to look at information retrieval approaches, 2 of them, and this table approach, the ILP approach. So for the IR part, we have 2 different corpora. For the web corpus, it's often also known as the Waterloo corpus. It has about 280 gigabytes of data from web pages scraped from like year 2000, many years ago. But presumably 4th grade knowledge hasn't changed since then. So that's like the big corpus. For sentence corpus, we take, that's just tokens with some sequence. There's no sentence boundaries. But when we turn them into sentences and that becomes part of the big sentence corpus. And we also have a bunch of domain-targeted sources from study guides, from textbooks, from scraping the web for similar sentences as what we see in the study guide. For table corpus, these are the tables that I mentioned earlier. For this experiment, we're using 65 of them that were interactively built using the predefined schemas, and 4 that were automatically generated using OpenIE style triples. So for each of these corpus, there's a corresponding solver. The PMI solver, and that's a statistical correlation-based solver. What it does is it computes the co-occurrence coefficient of each of the answer options with the question words based on the notion of point-wise mutual information in the large corpus. So if words that occur often in a big corpus, the hypothesis is that they are likely the answer. The IR information retrieval solvers uses a standard Lucene search to search over this big sentence corpus, picks the sentence that most closely matches, and the table solver, of course, does what I described. There's one more solver that I was going to mention, especially if Pedro was here, but he's not. But I'll still mention there's a Markov Logic Network-based solver that we also compare against that runs on these domain-targeted sources, and we extract probabilistic first-order logic rules from text and do Markov Logic Network inference over it. How does this do? Here is if you remember the ensemble of Aristo solvers, these are 3 solvers from that ensemble, not all of them. In terms of absolute scores on the test, the ILP approach does about the same as the IR approaches. Not so great, but if you're like me, if you have worked on this for 2 years, this is a big step forward. We started with IR approaches, just getting to a certain point from the beginning and just staying up there. And it's hard to improve them, but it's also hard to catch up to them. So finally, we have at least done that. The interesting part is that they are not answering the same kinds of questions. So in particular, if you look at the IR hard questions, and one way to think of them is simply the questions that multiple IR approaches don't get correct. If you look at how well the table ILP solver does, it gets a score of 54% compared to the random baseline of a quarter. So we have made some progress in answering questions that IR approaches could not answer. And if you put it formally together, learn a classifier over it, put it in an ensemble method, you see that you have statistical significantly better performance compared to each of the approaches if you just train a very simple logistic regression. The details of this they're not so important, but basically it's a simple classifier that takes 3 solvers, tries to get the best out of them. Okay, so that highlights complementarity of these approaches. In terms of exploiting structured or semi-structured knowledge, here's an experiment that shows that at least on the outset, and the ILP approach is better at doing so than a very structured Markov Logic Networks approach or information retrieval when given the same knowledge. And by that I mean this IR tables, which is to take all the tables, these 80,000 rows in search from which the tables came. Actually, tables have 10,000 rows. So take the 10,000 rows, convert them into 10,000 sentences by simple manipulation, do information retrieval over them. That doesn't do so well, but you can do much better by doing the approach I described. The very quick note about MLNs here. We did spend a lot of time last year trying to make a very structured approach like MLNs work on this problem. We had an NLP paper last year, explored multiple approaches. It seems like a very natural way to solve these things if you think of extracting rules from text as being natural. So like if X is an animal, X needs to be warm, then X needs fur. So this kind of rules can be derived, and once you have them, it feels very natural to do inference with it, with MLNs, but it's actually a very tricky problem. It's very slow, it's very hard to scale. You can employ more probabilistic similarity tricks like people do in entity resolution, but it just doesn't work very well, in part because it doesn't scale very well. And to give some numbers on the scaling, here's what the ILP system does. It has, as I said earlier, it has about 50 high-level constraints that translate into about 1,000 variables and 4,500 constraints at the grounded level. And you can kind of solve it in about 4 seconds, or 2 seconds to create the ILP, 2 seconds to solve it. Now, this is reasoning over not a huge database. That would be very hard. So we have a pre-selection step to narrow it down to about a few hundred rows and a few tables. But it still runs in certain reasonable time compared to MLN-like approaches that would take 17 seconds using only just one rule per question. And that's, of course, very, very brittle. If you gave it the wrong rule, you have no chance of getting the answer right, no matter how sophisticated the reasoning is. So in that sense, I personally see the step using integer programming and less structured knowledge than probabilistic first-order rules, a step in the right direction. Okay. So one last experiment here. Here we wanted to assess how brittle these different approaches are. So one approach we tried was take a question and ask Mechanical Turk, set up a Mechanical Turk things for people to create different variations of the questions. That didn't go so well. We have to ask the right thing to Turkers for them to give us meaningful questions. But we did come up with another way to just automatically generate perturbed questions with the idea to assess how robust different approaches are. And here a simple thing was to just keep the question as it is, keep the correct answer as it is, and just simply replace incorrect answers by things that happen to co-occur commonly in text. Right? So we are trying to make IR systems fail here. So that's part of my goal here. So we did that. We just posed the question as it is to Bing. It came up with certain top k hits. We took the snippets and took some co-occurring terms and put them as wrong answer options. One thing you might notice is that for a human, this actually makes the task much, much easier. Right? So Eastern history years, they have nothing to do with the question. You could easily rule them out. And even if you didn't know anything about orbital events, you could pick the right answer. But as you might expect, computers don't react the same way as humans. They all have a relative drop or an absolute drop in performance as soon as you perturb the question. But the point here is that IR and PMI statistical approaches suffer much more than the ILP more structured approach that I talked about. Right? So, I think PMI, you can imagine, we designed it to give things that co-occur very often. It should fail, but IR wasn't so clear it would drop by 20%, but it did. And so I think that gives some motivation to work in this direction of reasoning, where you can work hard, add constraints, add types, add other things to make it more robust. Oh, finally, to circle back to the question.
I'm sorry. Why is the ILP solution dropping its accuracy?
It's related to the question that you asked earlier. That even though you have the right support graph for the right answer, as soon as you introduce noise, you still have to do this hard task of picking the right table, making the right things. So it still has distracting information, and we haven't yet found a way to make sure that ILP doesn't go after that distracting information. And remember that it has those 4 automatically generated subject verb object triples, and they can throw you off in certain directions. So it's just that one of the other answer happens to get a better score, although you still had your correct answer. It's hard to say. It doesn't happen for this particular question, but it does happen for many other questions.
Have you tried adversarially creating questions? So for example, this seems like it's easy, but I was wanting to put in distractor answers like summer and warm.
So that's the task we did with Turkers, and maybe we should get some input from you to how to do it well. We asked them to create things where it would be deliberately distracting, and we couldn't come up with a good question set to play with, but that would be something. But I think that's a very interesting direction too. To circle back to this question where we had the New York State, and we were flipping one word at a time. As you might expect, since I'm presenting it here, the IR and PMI approaches both fail on one or the other of them, and the ILP approach, at least in this case, gets all of them right because it has the right support graph that embodies the kind of reasoning a person might do. Okay. Quick summary of the conclusions. I hope I have at least tried to convince you and convinced you to some extent that standardized tests are a great test bed for progressing AI and for measuring in a very concrete way how well we are doing. There are lots of fascinating questions in how you represent knowledge, how you reason with it, and how you make learning systems that get better with time. The semi-structured reasoning can be very effective in getting us beyond information retrieval methods. We have a bunch of ongoing efforts to do it better, particularly improving the semantics of what the solver is doing so that we don't get thrown off by these incorrect answers, and also to scaling up to large or at least medium scale knowledge bases. With that, I'll stop. I'll point you to a bunch of data sets that we have on our websites. If you have any questions, if anything interests you, please definitely drop me an email or any of us in the register group, and it will be great to follow up.
have the multiple choices, and would it be possible to extend the model?
That's a question that comes up often, and so most of the exam is multiple choice, but there are non-multiple choice too. If the non-multiple choice were of this category where the answer is a certain type, then I think that would work fairly well. You might need a preprocessor that narrows down your options from like nothing to maybe top 10 candidates. But often these fill-in-the-blank questions are bigger questions. You need the answer is like a big long phrase. That is sort of hard to get from this approach.
Have you faced any requests for automatic explanation generation? It's one thing to choose an answer, and it's another to justify it. Can you imagine your system somehow being able to synthesize an explanation that's credible to a human?
So that was one of our big goals to start with. The information retrieval methods completely threw it off, but now we are coming back to doing this reasoning, and I think the support graph is not as easy to see for a human and understand, but if you squint your eyes, it embodies the same kind of reasoning that I showed in the beginning, where you go from New York and daylight to the important concepts and down to the month. So I think at least this approach has a chance of massaging it in a way that it represents an explanation, and that also helps. Hopefully it helps us if you have the wrong answer, we can get feedback from users to detect why did we do wrong, because they could pinpoint that, oh, this step in the reasoning was wrong. And I think that's where reasoning can be extremely useful, and so is like crowdsourcing techniques to figure out how we can improve the system.
Does your system output like a confidence value in its answer, and how accurate is that?
So what it does is, since we are combining with an Ensemble solver, I didn't give the details, but it gets a score for all 4 answer options as long as it has a support graph. That actually has been harder than I imagined. Currently the score is simply the objective value of the ILP. It's a natural score, the higher the better. But normalizing in a way that makes sense, it's something 0 to 1, haven't figured out how to do it. So currently it's very qualitative. Bigger the better, but is 15 better than 13, more than 15 is better than 10? I don't know. But that's a very important thing, especially when we go to a very more detailed ensemble that actually relies on the scores, not just the ordering of things.
So when you formulate these IoT constraints, are these parts sort of like engineered, or are they learned?
Currently, they are engineered except for a bunch of parameters, and this automatic parameter tuning is one thing that we're doing. So the class of constraints is engineered, looking at the questions, figuring out what makes sense in this domain. This is a very interesting topic to figure out how to automate this process, or have maybe templates of constraints one might imagine, and an automated system pulls a subset that is relevant for the questions. We haven't gotten that far by any means, but at least we have exposed a bunch of parameters that you can tune at runtime based on your data set, and that might activate or deactivate certain constraints. But that's still not learning constraints. It's just choosing a subset of the constraints.
Looking at your knowledge graphs that are formed across different topics, do you see similarities across those topics to somehow constrain the types of knowledge graphs they create? They have a certain amount of links, they're a certain size, there's a certain amount of nodes.
I don't have a good answer to that. I think it would be easier to answer that if you actually coast an ontology around these things, to see that things like months and such always appear very often, and tables with months are always like yay long versus that long. But in terms of similarities across tables, yeah, we haven't looked much into it. But that's a good question in terms of this open problem of coming up, like given a new domain like biology, what are the right tables to generate? And that's a schema generation problem, and an insight like commonalities across existing tables could help predict what the next table should be.
Chris. So you brought up a question I've seen before, which is the experiment where you put a plant in light or not, and then the question asks, like, what is this testing? It's really hard for me to imagine, like, the right tables you need to answer this. Is that possible?
I think that I'm glad you picked up on that point. It's not at least it's not easy to see how that would be. That is a question that asks about, in experimental setting, it asks about two states of the world, right? So you have the same plant, it's in this setting, it's another plant that's in this setting. You need a very different kind of knowledge representation that is richer than just relations around it. I don't know if it's very different, but it's something that involves states, maybe changing the state to this to that, maybe the light changes, or what changes from one state to another. Maybe it's related to more like representing processes that I guess one of Dan's students is looking at. But it's a question that I think many approaches might answer correctly or not, but they're all answering for the wrong reason.
How do you see that you put a question and then it answers it well? So you put a question that's outside, like slightly outside of the domain that you put in the node space, and it will answer it random nearby node. Do you have to manually add extra information for every new small topic that you encounter?
So knowledge expansion is a big headache. For each new topic, we do have to get additional knowledge. We are looking into doing it in some sort of semi-automated ways, where we first start with a huge list of OpenIE triples, and then see do a topic modeling to figure out is there relevant information that is coherent that can be translated into a smaller table. But yes, if you don't have knowledge about a domain, it does get stuck.
Do they overlap? Like if you answer questions about astronomy and then questions about biology, do you use some of the same tables, or you construct separate ones?
So the tables are all the same. It's the same base that everybody sees.
But have they actually used in an overlapping way?
So that also goes back to Dan's questions. I would claim in that case the cities, regions, states question, that does get used in multiple different things. Sometimes it's irrelevant, but it's part of the question. Sometimes it is the key thing. Certain tables do get used. Certain others, like properties of materials or units of lengths, they are very specific to the topic, don't get used. Or I guess if certain things like this is the list of relevant animals, when these are animals or these are certain properties or certain materials, they can get used across different things, but still in a limited topic domain.
You mentioned some of your tables were populated with OpenIE triples. Were those from just like sort of running on the science-based corpus, or was where was that data?
This was running from science corpus. So there's about 80,000 sentences by scraping this Barron's study guide and a few development questions and some what else was there? The syllabus itself. And then what we did was train a classifier that gets a sentence from the web and train it to see, is this sentence like the Barron's sentences you have seen? So that's how it's about 100,000 sentences.
Did you consider trying to just run OpenIE on a huge corpus of documents and see how that affects things?
So Oren has been pushing on that to see how it goes. My current feel is that noisy, lots of knowledge is worse than less but more reliable knowledge. Or at least clustered into chunks that are coherent. So I basically offload my troubles to knowledge extraction people's troubles.
Last question. So have you been applying this approach only to sort of the simpler multiple choice questions, or have you also looked at this approach for more complicated questions involving charts? Because it seems like it'd be difficult as a question to go from a bar graph to tabulated knowledge.
We haven't looked at this particular approach, but the point you raise is that the reason this will probably not work is because that's a different structure. It's still structured with charts and graphs, but it's not the same structure. There's another group that's working on diagram questions in terms of food chains, where they'll show like a cat eating a mouse, eating some grass, things like that. So those are diagram questions with a different structure. It's yet to be seen if this can work there, or do you need a very specific domain knowledge.
Great. Well, thank you so much.